Within an office, when new projects are started, typically a template file is used, and a template file would already have certain settings defined, such as title blocks, paper sizes, printers. Another important feature that would be incorporated into style is dimension styles, text styles, and multi-leader styles. It's important that when working on drawings, creating drawings within an office, that everybody's drawings look the same. And that means standardizing the appearance of text, standardizing the appearance of dimensions, and multi-leaders, among many other things. So we're going to look at the settings involved with defining a text style, defining a dimension style, and defining a multi-leader style. This isn't something you're going to have to do very often, but it's good to be aware of what the settings represent. And especially in this, the situation or the example of a dimension style, we're not even going to look at all the settings because there are just so many different variables. So let's start off with the text style. So I have opened an AutoCAD drawing using the default AutoCAD template file. And in the home ribbon, we have a panel annotation. There's also a ribbon annotate where you can find a lot of the settings that we're working with, but let's stick with the home ribbon for now. So you see the text command, the dimension command, the linear dimension command, the leader command, and the table command. But if you select the bottom bar of this panel, you'll see annotation. And you're going to see drop-down lists for each of the different styles already created for each of the different categories of information. I'm going to use the push pin here just to keep that extended. So you'll see that there are 4 standard styles, but there are variations such as annotative, 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 and you'll only find standard for tables because tables can't be annotative. So the buttons to the left actually launch the style command for each of these different types of objects or categories of objects. So I'm going to unpin this and let's take a look at the text style command. So the text style command is comprised of just one basic dialog box, no tabs. We have a list of the current styles. We have down here a preview of whatever the highlighted style is. We have a section right here for defining what font is used, and if a font has variable styles, which style can be selected. Do we want our text style to be annotative? In my opinion, yes is the answer to that. Annotative allows the text heights to change based on whatever the viewport scale is, so that if you have multiple viewports on a sheet with different scales, on the printed sheet, the text looks like it's the same height. And then we have effects. So defining whether text appears upside down or backwards with the oblique angle. So we're going to take a look at most of the settings here. First of all, we've got over here set current, new, and the delete button for the style names themselves. So I'm going to select new, and I'm going to create Kirby's, I'm going to give it a name, Kirby's text style. So let's look at font. We have a drop-down list of all the fonts that are currently installed on this computer. Now be warned that most programs that are installed on a computer will add additional fonts. And if you were to pick a font that looks nice, it may not actually be installed on all computers. Like for example, Arial, you'll find it on all computers. Next to the name Arial, you see there's double T's. That means this is a true type font. A true type font is a font that can be used either in AutoCAD or any other Windows-based program. But we also have fonts that have this little symbol next to it. If we look at this particular one here, it looks like a compass. And those are fonts that are AutoCAD specific. So they will only show up in AutoCAD files. And they're very simplistic. They're made up of straight lines, curved lines, no fills or anything like that. But if you pick a fancy font, such as this one, and I have no idea what that's going to look like, looks different. But if I were to create this style, use this style, and then email my drawing to somebody else, then when they open it up, if this particular style is not installed on their computer, it's going to swap out that style or that font for something that it thinks is similar, and odds are it won't be all that similar. So you want to make sure you stick with the standard, easy to read fonts. None of this city blueprint or country blueprint stuff. We want to have something that's very clear, and Arial is a pretty good one. Arial happens to have a variety of styles that can be applied, such as regular, if we look at the preview down here, bold, italic, and regular. So the idea behind this style in my head is that it's going to be used just for general notes. So, do we want this style to be annotative? Yes. And so you check that off. Now, if for paper text height, if you give it a specific height, then that's the height it's going to always use. But odds are you're going to want to be able to use or apply variable heights. So if that's set to 0, then when you place text on a sheet, you can use different heights depending on what the text is used for. Either or is fine. If I had named this Kirby's general text style, then I probably would set that to whatever my default or whatever my standard text height would be for general notes, such as 1/8 of an inch or 3/32 of an inch. Effects. So take a look at some of these effects. These two I wouldn't use very often. Upside down, backwards. Vertical would allow you to place text oriented vertically, but each letter would be read left to right. It's not like taking text and rotating it 90 degrees. That's grayed out because this particular font doesn't support that feature. Width factor. I'm going to go extreme with this. If I were to set this to 0.5, you can see how narrow it gets. So you're talking about whatever the natural text shape is, varying the width factor. Some people like to see text a little narrower, like 0.5, 0.9, 0.8. But in all honesty, if I wanted a narrower text, I would pick for a font Arial narrow, and then that gives you the effect. As a matter of fact, I'm going to keep that. Oblique angle. So text, this particular font, text is straight up and down, the letters, but if you want them to slant one way or another, you can set an angle of 15, for example, degrees. You can see how the lettering slants in one direction. -15 would have it slant in the other direction. Again, if I wanted my text to slant this way, I would pick italic, and that would apply a default slant to the lettering. So apply, if I already had text in my drawing using that particular style, apply would apply the changes to those pieces of text. And close closes the dialog box, saving what you've just added. And if I were going up to these buttons right here, set current will set the highlighted text style as my current style. So I'm going to select apply and close. So now if I place text in my drawing, it's going to ask, because it's annotative, what is the current scale? I'm going to accept the default, but I could have picked some of the other different scales, and I can click to define my multi-line box and multi-line text box, and there it is. Now here's the importance of using annotation as a property of a text style. If I go to my layout, I'm deleting the existing viewport. But let me go to the viewport command, and I'm going to create, let me add in a rectangular viewport, and let me set the scale of that viewport to, I don't know, 1 to 5. Let me create a second viewport here. I'm going to set that viewport scale to 1 to 10. So if I double click in this viewport and I go to add text, it will accept the current text height to be, let's see, let's look at properties, Control 1. The current text height is not set to anything yet, so let's add some text. Kirby 1 to 5. Now, you'll see that we place this text in this viewport. We set the height. We didn't actually set the height, but if we take a look here, you'll see that the text height is 0.2 units. That's fine. Now, it's not appearing over here because it has, this viewport has a different scale. But if I add in text here, Kirby 1 to 10, then it's, you know, a bit of an optical illusion here, but the text height actually on the page is the same height. And that's what annotative scaling means. It looks to the scale of the viewport as a property of the text and scales the default text height, in this case 0.2, up by whatever the scale factor is. Now you only see in this situation the text height that is currently defined for that particular scale. But down in our bar at the bottom right, you'll see we have show annotation objects at current scale, at current scale. Sorry, when that's turned on, you can see all the different versions of the text visible in each viewport. If I turn that off, I only see the text set to that particular scale. So that's considerations for the things you need to consider when creating a text style. Keep in mind again, this is not something you're going to have to do very often. It's something that's typically done or modified in a template file. Let's have a look at dimension styles. Going back to model space, let's have a look under the annotation panel, dimension styles. So we're going to create a new one. So we'll say new Kirby's dimension style, and we want to make this annotative. So you see there are lots of tabs for this command, or this styles command. Lines, symbols and arrows, text, fit, primary units, alternate units, and tolerances. Many of these are irrelevant to the kind of work we do in architecture, but I will briefly go over them. Number one, lines. So this tab controls the appearance of the lines that make up your dimensions. That'll be dimension lines, extension lines, the gaps involved, how far lines go beyond arrows. So this section here is about the dimension lines themselves. So color, line type, line weight, those should, for the most part, 99% of the time, set to by block. By block means the same in this case as by layer, so it allows the dimension layer to control the appearance of these dimensions. Extend beyond ticks. Well, if we were using tick marks, we're using arrowheads, then you would be able to see a line going beyond the tick marks. This is grayed out because we're not using them. Baseline spacing, if you're using baseline dimensioning where you have multiple dimensions from the same starting point, each subsequent dimension is going to be spaced from the previous, and so that's where you control that. Suppress dim line 1 and 2 is whether or not you suppress the line and arrow on one side of the dimension text or the other. Extension lines, same appearance-based options, by block, by block, by block, and line weight. For by block, the extension lines being the lines that extend from the object being dimensioned up to the dimension line and beyond. We've got suppress extension line 1 or 2, so maybe we don't want to see one extension line or the other. Typically we will want to see them both, so neither of these are checked off. Extend beyond dim lines is this part of the dimension line. Offset from origin is the gap that we have, and fixed line extensions means that, well, if you're dimensioning and you click to locate where you want the dimension line to be, usually the extension line will vary depending on how far away you click, but you have the ability to say, I don't care how far away I click from the dimension. For the dimension line, I want the extension lines to be a specific thickness or length. Symbols and arrows. So we're talking about the dimension terminators here. So we have the ability to change what we use for the ends of the dimensions, such as we can use arrows or tick marks. There are lots of other ones here, but many of them are not specific to architecture. AutoCAD is used in many other disciplines. So we stick to either close-filled, close blank, or architectural tick. So I'm going to pick architectural tick, and you can see what that looks like in the preview. So that's the first, the second, and leaders. I'm going to leave leaders as arrowheads, but you could, if you're using leaders for your dimension text, change that to the same options that we saw in the drop-down list for other arrowheads. Arrow size, so how big is the arrow size / tick mark going to be? Take a look at the center mark for the dimension for the circle. You have that little plus sign. If you select line, you have that little plus sign symbol, and then you have extended lines beyond to sort of make that stand out more, or you have none, which just totally gets rid of that mark. For the mark, this measurement represents the size of the mark. If dimension breaks are required, this determines the size of those dimension breaks. Arc length symbol, when you're dimensioning the length of an arc, which is the length along the curvature of the arc, that is defined as a number with a symbol, looks like an upside down U. So it's asking you, do you want that upside down U to be in front of the dimension number, or do you want it above the dimension text, or do you not want to have one at all? If you require a jog in a dimension for radius, this determines the angle of that jog, and the jog height, so the zigzag, how tall will that be? In this case, 1.5 times whatever the text height happens to be. Text tab. What style of text do you want to use? I'm going to use the new standard, which is Kirby's text style. Again, we have text color by block, fill color none. That is used, I think, when you're using arrowheads that are solid filled. Text height. I'm going to use the text height that we used when we were doing text styles. If we were using a unit of measure that had fractions involved, then this would not be grayed out. But if we did have units of measure with fractions involved, then we would be able to set how high the fraction text would be. Draw frame around text. We'll put a rectangle around the dimension text. Again, that's something you see in other disciplines of drafting. Text placement. Take a look at in the preview where the text is placed with reference to the dimension line. It's basically breaking the dimension line. You can see it right here as well. So Text placement, vertical. I'm going to only focus on the top two because those are the ones we use in our particular discipline. So centered is the default. Above, we'll place the dimension text above the dimension line. Horizontally. So between the extension lines, where do we want to see the text shifted? It's not something I typically see with a dimension style. Usually if you need to shift the text of a dimension, you can use grips to do that. And it's usually on a 1 or 2 dimension situation. So setting the style to do that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but it's obviously there for a reason. View direction, left to right or right to left. And you can see that it rotated that the text 180 degrees. Offset from dimension line is what the gap is between the bottom of the text and the actual dimension line, so that can be adjusted as well. Text alignment. Horizontal is the default setting, so that means no matter what kind of a dimension it is, the dimension text is read left to right. Align with dimension line will provide your text positioning to match whatever the dimension line angle is. And ISO standard is exactly the same except for radii and diameter dimensions are read left to right. So they don't synchronize with the angle of the dimension line itself. We're going to pick aligned with dimension line. Fit. This is a tab I kind of stay away from. There are lots of different, a lot of different fine-tuning options here. I'm not even going to go into any detail about them. The only one that really matters to us is whether or not the style is annotative. So I've already checked that off when I created the style, so that's fine. So we'll bypass that. Primary units. So we can define here what the units of measure are for our dimensions. So right now we have decimal, but if we change it to say architectural, we can see that those numbers have changed in the preview. If we're using fractions, or if we have fractions, if you look at this preview, 1 3/16 of an inch, the separating line is horizontal for the fraction. Diagonal gives you a diagonal line, and not stacked will simply place all the text in a row for the number with a slash indicating the fraction. If we were not using a fraction-based dimension style, if we were using decimal, then we would have the ability to control what's used to separate the whole numbers from the decimal numbers. In Europe, for example, they would use commas. Round off, little dangerous, that one. It will round off your dimension numbers. So if you look at this one, it says 1.1955. If I set a round off figure, it would display at whatever I set it to, such as 1.2. So that means the text isn't being accurate as to what the measurement is. Prefix, suffix. Do you need a piece of text to appear before or after each dimension text? So let's say the dimensions need to be have the letters MIN for minimum. Then it will place the text after each piece of each dimension number. Measurement scale is another dangerous one. That is a multiplier for dimension measurements. So it will literally change the number of the dimension from being what it truly is to whatever what it truly is times whatever this number is. Zero suppression. So with zero suppression, let me actually go back to architectural because I think architectural really sort of shows it better. Zero suppression, feet. So that's checked off. That means that if a measurement is less than a foot, it won't bother putting in the dimension text 0 feet dash and then whatever the measurement is. Watch what happens when I uncheck this. You can now see this dimension says 0 feet dash 1 inch. 0 inches. If you had a dimension that was 2 feet dash 0 inches, if this is unchecked, then it would actually show that it only has 2 feet. It's the other way around, actually. Yeah. this checked off, it will not show the 0 inches. So the same options here for units, but in regard to specifically for angles, what do you want your angles measured with? What precision do you want? And 0 suppression. Alternate units. Some industries require drawings to have dimensions that show both imperial and metric. So if you were to check this off, then you'll see that the dimensions have changed to show, it's hard to see in the preview, I'll do an actual dimension to show you what that looks like. But it's showing inches, and then in square brackets, the millimeter measurement of that. So the second number in square brackets is based on what the settings are here. I'm going to leave this turned on just so you can see what that looks like. Tolerances. Some industries require tolerances, meaning the measurement is X measurement plus or minus a quarter inch or 0.001. So that's how you would turn that on. And then once you turn it on, you can then make changes to whatever the settings are. So I'm going to click OK, and I'm going to set current and click close. So let me draw a rectangle. And let me add in a linear dimension. So you can see what I mean by the alternate units. So 3 1/16 of an inch, square bracket 78.04. This dimension here is 1 5/8 of an inch, 41.54 millimeters. I don't know about you, but in our architecture, decimal millimeters isn't a really a valid sort of a measurement. Nobody's ever going to cut something to that kind of accuracy. So what we can do there is if we go back to the dimension style and go to modify, if we go to alternate units, we can change the precision from 2 places past the decimal to 0 places past the decimal. Click OK, and close, and now it rounds the dimension text, or just removes the decimal measurements. So let me go back into dimension style, modify. I'm going to turn off alternate units and click OK. There we go. Let's go to our layouts. Remember, we set these dimensions to be annotative. So we've got layout. So we've got this this viewport set to a scale of 1 to 5. Actually, I think what I might do is just change that so that the rectangle looks larger to 1 to 2. Yeah. So I'll lock that scale. And this one here I'll make, I don't know, 1 to 4. All right, so going back to this viewport, I'll add some dimensions. And by the way, what I'm doing here is I go to the linear dimension command. If I know I'm dimensioning a line, this one object, I can right click rather than picking each line, and then I can just pick the object I want to dimension. So over here in this viewport, I'll do the same thing. So again, the importance of annotative scaling is that 2 viewports, different scales, but the dimension numbers, the tick mark sizes, the extension beyond the dimension line, and the gap between the object being dimensioned and the extension line stay same. Let's have a look at multi-leader styles. So picking up where we left off, we've got our dimensions and our two viewports here. Going back to model space, you can see it's displaying all the different sizes of dimensions. I'm just going to delete them. Each of those sizes is based on the fact that the dimensions were created at 1 to 1, 1 to 5, and 1 to 10. So you can see the size difference there. So going to the annotation panel, expanding this is our dialog box for multi-leaders. And once again, we have our listing of existing styles. On the right, we have set, current, new, modify, and delete, and we have a preview. So let me create a new one. I'm going to call this one Kirby's. And I couldn't turn off cap lock, so let's try this again. I want this to be annotative as well. I'll click continue. Only 3 tabs. Number 1 is the leader format. Do we want straight lines or do we want splines? So there's curvature to the leader line. Color by block, line type by block, line weight by block, which corresponds to by layer. Arrowhead, we can choose, just like in dimensions, the different types of arrowheads or terminators and the size. And if you need to have a break in your leader, then you can define the size of that break. Leader structure. How many points when you're creating a leader do you want to be able to add? So it's set to 2. So you pick a point for where the arrowhead goes, you pick a point for the first elbow, you pick a point to show where the text goes or starts. So the higher the number, the more points you have to click on in order to finally end up with some text. First segment angle, you can force an angle for the first segment so you have some consistency, so 45 degrees throughout all the leaders, so it looks a lot neater. And you can also define an angle for the second line, so the first one being 45 degrees, second one would say be 0. All right, so I'll set those to you set those, and then I'll show you what that looks like. A landing is a flat area added to the leader, and it's set to annotative. Content. So what text format do you want? Multi-leader text. Text style, we'll set it to my text style. Text angle, always keep it horizontal. Text color by block or / by layer. I'll set the height to the standard for this drawing, which is 0.2 units. Always left. Frame text. Leader connection, horizontal or vertical. So you can see in the preview what the difference is. Horizontal or vertical. And with each of these, they have their own options. Middle of the top line of text, middle of the bottom line, all kinds of different ones to choose from. And the landing gap is the space here, or the length of the landing gap. Extend leader to text will actually get rid of this blank empty part right here between the leader line and the default text. So I'm going to shift right click. I'll pick midpoint here to here. I'm not typing out multi-leader because I'm feeling lazy. So there is your leader. If we go and make a change to the style, let's say I want to not use a spline, but use a straight line, series of straight line segments, that's where these angles will actually come into play for the first segment line and the second segment angle. See, this is guaranteed to be horizontal. So if I add in a multi-leader here, shift right click, I'll just say nearest. See, as I'm positioning or moving my mouse around, that first line is 45 degrees, the second line is perfectly horizontal. So if I want to, I could, with this text, have brought it down to 2 lines if I needed to, and take a note of where this line is located in reference to the block of text. It is centered on the height of this text right here. If I go back to my style, modify content, so horizontal attachment, middle of top line, let's say I use middle of text. Now it is lined up with the middle of the text. So that's how that would work. It's going to the layout. Remember, we've got these 2 viewports. I've already locked that viewport scale, which is good. So if I go and add a leader here, shift right click nearest, just so it's not snapping to a corner. Notice that the arrowhead doesn't show up or appear until I drag my mouse away from what's being dimensioned a certain distance. It will not place an arrow if there isn't enough line length to actually make the arrow appear. 1, 2, 5, scale. Go over to this viewport. One, 2, 10, scale. My viewport is not large enough, so I'm just gonna, there we go. And again, the importance of annotation, or annotative scaling, I should say. On the sheet, the text heights are the same. On the sheet, the arrowhead sizes are the same. And on the sheet, the gap between the text and the leader line are the same.